Hello, and welcome to the EUROPAST podcast. This podcast is part of the international project EUROPAST, funded from the Horizon Europe Wideera program. EUROPAST tackles contemporary issues in memory studies, memory politics, political discourse, and most importantly, public history, a field of study and practice that explores the ways in which the production of knowledge about history can be rendered more democratic, open, collaborative, and empowering, as well as the challenges associated with this process. In this podcast, members of the project team talk to public history practitioners, researchers, historians, activists, filmmakers, and many others about the developments, challenges, and implications of this fascinating approach of dealing with the past. If you would like to know more about the project, follow EUROPAST on Facebook and Twitter. We hope you enjoyed today's episode.
Hello, welcome to another episode of EUROPAST podcast series. My name is Violeta Davoliūtė. I am the leader of EUROPAST. We are here at Lund University today, and I will have a pleasure to talk to Dr. Odeta Rudling, who is working at the Department of History, Lund University in Sweden. In 2023, Odeta published a book on the role of the folklore in the rise of national movement in Lithuania from 1940 to 1990. The title of the book is From the National Form to the National Content, Lithuanian Folklore Between Sovietization and Nation Building. And it is part of the series Forschungen zur osteuropäischen Geschichte 2023. Welcome.
Thank you.
Your research focuses on the impact of folklore and tourism during the Soviet period, but you yourself are an extremely well-traveled person. You lived in several countries and traveled from the small town of Kriukai to different parts of the world. Tell a few words about yourself.
So, yes, I was born in Kriukai and raised there. And from my childhood there, I, as well as from my visit to Kaliningrad region when I was 12 years old, I learned my first foreign language, which was Russian. And at that time, I didn't realize that it will play such a big role in my career. After finishing the school in 2001, I ended up migrating to Germany, where I at first worked as au pair, and then picked up German language very fast and realized quite quickly that I actually want to study there. So my studies started in 2004, and I studied German linguistics and history and graduated from there in 2009. By 2010, I started my doctoral studies at Harrasowitz University, where I actually ended up at a very multicultural environment that was also working together with Lund University and Tartu University. So my doctoral studies took quite a time because I was living between continents and countries. First, shifting from or leaving Sweden and leaving Germany and moving to Sweden, then from Sweden moving to Singapore and then back to Sweden again. And at the same time also becoming a mother of two boys. So I ended up defending my dissertation in 2019 from Harrasowitz University. And the title of the dissertation was The Paradox of Socialist Folklore, Lithuania and Folk Music Between Sovietization and Nation Building, 1940 to 1990.
Now you're the mother of three boys, right?
Yes.
Because you mentioned two boys. So when did you have the third son?
3 months after defense.
Right. So that passed 2019, right?
Yes, it was the same year.
Yeah. Mm-hmm. In 2023, you published a book which is based on your dissertation. Can you share with us your most important findings and the argument of your book?
I can try. the focus of my book is the central and local policy of the Communist Party within the field of Soviet Lithuanian folklore that I approach from the special point of view of Sovietization and nation building between 1940 to 1990. And the main thesis statement of my book is that the Sovietization actually pushed the nation building forward. And how do I mean that? And this is basically the framework of the book, is that the brutal terror, including deportations and killings, caused a trauma and at the same time vindicated a nationalism that was unprecedented before. And that, of course, is valid also for other Baltic republics. Secondly, the economic and cultural modernization led to establishment of strong elites that in turn also were trained in political leadership, which again became very important for the shifting, from Soviet power to independence. And finally, the daily practices stimulated nationalism, and this is basically my focus within the book. So my major inspiration is Miroslav Hroch's three-phase model that I don't want to bother you with in detail. Another major source of inspiration was the authors that wrote about Korenizacija within the Soviet Union, meaning indigenization policy that supported, the local language, local culture, as well as the local cadres of certain ethnicities. And usually it is claimed that this Korenizacija was taking place during the 20s and 30s, but I follow some other colleagues and claim that this process actually continued throughout the entire Cold War period. That is from 1945 to 1990. And so the entire book basically shows how Lithuanian nation is moving ahead towards this goal of mass mobilization, which I see implemented during the Singing Revolution.
Can you tell our readers what Singing Revolution is?
Well, Singing Revolution was this massive movement from below, basically, from people that were driven by the emotions, awakened by the Sąjūdis movement, and just became, the massive force that accompanied Sąjūdis movement, and it was very much concentrated on musical expressions. You can also see that in pictures. Their especially aesthetics of national costume were very, very much present, but also singing was in general a very common thing to do in order to state what people felt at that time, rejecting the regime, but at the same time also turning what was Soviet into Lithuanian.
Mm-hmm. And just to clarify, do you claim that happened during the popular movement, during the time of Sąjūdis or the time of Perestroika, or already before that?
Oh, it happened already before that, obviously.
Because I kind of also tried to trace that in my monographs. So I think our thinking is probably aligned to a certain extent, right?
Yeah, that's why, I was inspired by your rustic turn thesis.
And other colleagues, right?
Yeah. So the key findings connect to interconnected contexts. One context would be the concrete party policy that was illustrated in the creation and maintenance of, state ensemble dance for dances and for songs and dances, as well as in the establishment of Stalinist mass culture. The other context that I also looked at was this post-Stalinist, anti-modernist youth movement that arose in the field of tourism and local history field and became some sort of alternative to sanctioned mass culture.
Are we talking about the local tourism?
Yes, we talk about local tourism. Basically inter-Soviet tourism.
Right.
That, of course, in case of Lithuania, as I think in many republics as well, was rather, the focus was rather on the own republic. But then some others, of course, also chose to explore the entire Soviet Union. And then I connect these two fields when I try to illustrate the actual massiveness of the movement. And here, counting basically the participants. So on the one hand, the layman activities, folkloristic layman activities, ended up building approximately 500,000 of people by late 1980s. And similarly, this field of tourism and local history that was mainly driven by people from below, counted by 1968 approximately 1 million of people that were involved into this, amateur tourism movement that also viewed folklore, but rather the authentic folklore, as a source of Lithuanianness.
Right. Describe this concept of authenticity to our listeners. I believe that this concept is quite important for your research. And also, how has the concept of authenticity changed? Let's say, is this was it around during Stalinist period, or is it something that came around during the period of so-called thaw, that is Khrushchev's period? Yeah.
Very good question. So on authenticity, of course, it's an important concept in itself, but I focused not to make it an analytical concept, because it is also loaded ideologically. So having that in mind, I approach authenticity as a concept of my sources. And sources meaning those people that were involved into these movements. And now I'm speaking about post-Stalinist period, after the secret speech of Nikita Khrushchev, when this, to some extent, organized from below, but also supported from the top, movement came into being, that promoted the authentic folklore. And what was authentic folklore? It was less focus on, the usual fake folklore expressions, such as focusing, on Sputnik, or singing about electrification or hydropower plants, but rather this look at the village and the so-called living tradition that was rather primitive, simple, and aesthetically less appealing. But it appealed to that people also because it was a replacement to that state-driven ethno-nationalism.
Why did it happen? Why was there an interest to promote this authentic expression?
Well, I think it was a way to reject the regime. So what authenticity implicated, and I trace that in the discussions and the debates throughout the 1960s and 70s, how people actually approached the question of authenticity. And often it was, it was often a synonym to what is good, rather than it was, really an expression of realness or genuineness or whatever that would be in case of living folklore, let's say. So, and at the same time, it became also a replacement for certain groups of people who saw in this authentic folklore the Lithuanianness, the reflection of Lithuanianness and Lithuanian identity, such as, for example, Vytautas Landsbergis, who during the 70s wrote multiple articles about how sutartinis, regarded as a very special and probably primarily example of this authentic folklore, should be a basis for national music.
So what were your sources? Debates among Soviet intelligentsia? Because at that time, Vytautas Landsbergis was also part of Soviet local intelligentsia. And another question, did you just look at the debates in Lithuania or all over the former USSR, or different, particular republics? Basically, what were your sources?
Well, the sources concern only Lithuania. All sources I use, because I use various of sources, including archival sources. But specifically for these debates, I was looking at the newspapers. Mostly newspapers such as Kultūros barai or Literatūra ir menas, some other relevant press. Of course, Landsbergis was, of course, also a part of, the Soviet intelligentsia. But at the same time, he was also involved, at least he claims, that he was involved into this movement within the framework of tourists and local historians. So in that sense, he was definitely related to those groups and to what they believed in.
Who were the other people in those groups?
Well, it's difficult to name them all now, but of course, mostly students, but also teachers, lecturers at the universities were involved. People, just to name a few names, such as Vidmantas Paviljonis, who was also Žygeivis, but not only that. Also Jonas Trinkūnas, who later became the head of, paganism movement. Of course, paganism played a role there. Quite significant role.
Say a few words about that. That's quite interesting. Lithuanians were the last pagans in Europe. They sometimes take pride in that. But what are we talking about when we mention this pagan movement during the Soviet period?
Well, Soviet authorities kind of supported a bit this idea as an opposite field to Catholicism. It was instrumentalized in that sense, and in turn it actually became something valuable and something important to those people, because they envisioned the true Lithuanianness also connected to this pagan practices. And of course there were kind of two ways of doing that. One way would be this very close to the party thing, and another way would be to distance yourself from that. And the Kravedinė or Kraštotyra movement ended up being forbidden by 1971. For good reason, because the party actually asked itself, why do they sing only, Lithuanian songs? Why don't they sing also party? Why don't they think about the party and about the party achievements? So it was rather the lack of the sanctioned culture that they saw in this in this field of this movement that was a problem for the party than anything else. The paganism was very strongly connected to this idea that was promoted by Marija Gimbutas or Marija Gimbutienė about...
She's an American, sorry to interrupt you, she's an American anthropologist, right, of Lithuanian origin, or is she a folklore expert?
Archaeomythologist,
That's
as
right,
she describes herself. And she wrote quite important books about Slavs and about the Balts. Interestingly, these books were translated by these tourists or Kraštotyra enthusiasts many times, so they knew these books very well. Some of them claimed, that the proto-Baltic tribes were actually spreading their hegemony throughout Europe, which they, of course, took, as a reason to take pride in that. And also...
She was interested in matriarchy too. She was arguing with
yes,
Baltic
but that
goddesses.
was not the most popular field.
Right.
And then she also wrote about, how the village culture, let's say village architecture, for example, preserved certain elements of paganism.
So she visited Lithuania several times during...
Yes.
What, late Soviet period, the 60s?
Yes, actually 3 times. I think first time was around 1965. The second time was, I think, 1968. And she received enormous attention. People were so interested to hear about Lithuanian or proto-Baltic deities and gods. So it was a very, very popular, obviously very, very popular field. And they actually took her as an inspiration. This is where it actually started.
So I wanted to ask you, did she influence these local groups, the local movements somehow, like at the university or elsewhere? What's the connection? They're talking about tourism, right, within the USSR?
Yes, she actually, I found a letter from her written to Vytautas Kavolis, where she explains that she actually, met these enthusiastic students that were kind of recreating the paganism or the pagan religion at Vilnius University. So she definitely was a major source of inspiration for them. And I think they tried to keep some sort of contact, but of course it wasn't very easy.
So how did the Soviet authorities, KGB and so on, look at it?
Well, I worked with the KGB documents as well, especially the KGB documents that were looking into Vilnius University activities, for example. I haven't noticed any specific attention to Maria Gimbutas or Gimbutiene. It was rather the interest into those, students. And the problem was that they often interconnected with the former political prisoners.
Right. You mentioned Kraštotyra, and this may not be known to our readers, so I will just mention that the dominant methodology of Lithuanian heritage studies is called Kraštotyra, which is translated in English as local history, and it traces its genealogical roots to the Soviet and Russian practice of krayevedenie, which itself can be traced back to the German practice of Heimatkunde. So please explain the geopolitical and historical context behind this German-Russian background to local history museums.
Mm-hmm. So in the late Russian Empire, a new practice called krayevedenie, or Kraštotyra in Lithuanian, implying excursions through the homeland, which is also Heimat in German, was adopted. And that was basically the German practice, something that occurred in Germany already in the 18th century and was promoted also centuries after that. So they took that German practice and turned it into a excursion school practice in the Russian Empire. And obviously, it was spread throughout all the multi-ethnic groups.
And what period are we talking about?
We talk about late 19th century, beginning of 20th century at first. It spread explicitly a lot at the beginning of 20th century. So after the revolution, the Soviet
after the Bolshevik Revolution,
yes,
you mean?
After the Bolshevik Revolution, 1917, it was taken over by the Soviet authorities, which was turned into a centrally driven layman activity or layman mission in order to conserve and to preserve local heritage, and also exploit regional resources. So during 1920s and 30s, the network of competences of krayevedenie expanded, also strengthening separatist tendencies in these various of regions, which also was the reason for repressions by the late 1920s, which is also very interesting because in result of these repressions, people felt that they are martyrs and survivors of this, very special field, kind of ignored by the Soviet authorities. So when the focus in my own focus in my book, I look what happens after 1956. When this Kraštotyra practice was revived on the union level after the 22nd Party Congress in 1961, and it was meant to re-ideologize the youth by, giving them instrument for democratic participation. Mm-hmm. And at the same time, it was meant also to recreate the unity of the Soviet Union that was very strongly damaged after the secret speech by Nikita Khrushchev.
Can you tell a few words about what was happening with that during the Stalinist period?
Krajevedenie or Heimatkunde or whatever you call it didn't receive much attention. It was very ideologized, and it was meant basically mostly for promotion of Soviet patriotism, which was also the case after Stalin, but in a different ways, because also the regional autonomy of the republics were actually strengthened after Stalin. So the republics had so much more, potential to expand their, individual activities, right?
Right.
In Lithuania, it starts in late 1950s. Driven by Antanas Stravinskas, for example, one of the first circles of Kraštotyra were implemented by 1957, and then only later, by 1961, a institution on the republic level was implemented, which is, I think, very interesting that it was really a movement from below.
Right. What's interesting to me then, okay, so we are in Lithuania, and you said similar things were happening in Latvia and Estonia. What about the other Soviet republics? There were 15 Soviet republics. We're talking about the quote-unquote Baltic republics. What's happening elsewhere in Ukraine, Moldova, Belarus, Russia?
I read an article, for example, on Uzbek national consciousness, and this is where this local history was very much instrumentalized to strengthen the national consciousness. But also in Russian parts of Soviet Union, it was actually very, very much common thing that it strengthened these, localism ideas. To some extent, what relates also to your book and to Rustic Turn, I would say that was a Soviet Union-wide phenomenon.
Right? Because I'm also thinking about the origins, inspiration by, writers who wrote village prose or Derevenskaya prosa and, yes. Other forms of creative expression and so on. Mm-hmm. Right. So we're basically talking about this, as you said, about the revival of these practices after death of Stalin, right?
Right. Yeah. They start by, like I said, around 1956,
right.
Union-wide. And interestingly, they obviously start, I think, everywhere from below, so that, it starts as some sort of movement. Actually, the books written at that time, let's say 60s, about Kraštotyra in very Soviet sense of the word, was also using the word judėjimas, movement. So it's not that I, from my point of view, from today's perspective, think that this is how it was, and it can be described as some sort of a movement moving towards independence.
So how are the Baltic states different or similar to other republics, if you would just kind of make broad strokes?
Within this field?
Mm-hmm.
Well, I mainly looked at Russia, and it seems to me that the literary field was very heavy, inspired by that, other than obviously the Lithuanian case. I think there is such a strong enthusiasm when it comes to folklore in our countries. And I guess Lithuania is very much comparable to Estonia and Latvia in that sense too.
Right. What do you think this has to do with public history?
Well, this definitely has to do with public history, because those people were, history was their hobby, basically. And history of many periods. First of all, it was very popular to look at the Middle Ages and even older history, as I hopefully correctly indicated with the interest of Maria Gimbuta's work and things like that, but also the interest, in Eastern Prussia was very strong at that time, and promoted also strongly by the party as well. as well as the possibility to reconnect with history that was given through the restoration of the heritage, architectural heritage. But these people were also interested in more recent history, such as, the crash of Lituanica, for example, and the flight, which they understood as something very much worth to take pride in. Darius and Gerenas, obviously.
Well, this is a plane crash that took place during the interwar period, 1933. Two Lithuanian pilots who wanted to cross the Atlantics almost made it, but then died in a plane crash, and they became big Lithuanian heroes. And it was kind of a wider message to promote Lithuania, to make Lithuania famous, this heroic deed, and so on.
And some of them actually even went to Siberia, to the territories far away from Lithuania, in order to rediscover Lithuanian history, because they, for example, traveled to Siberia, to these villages where Lithuanians were living, because they were very interested in, how these people lived there, and maybe they can help. Or they also traveled to the border regions of Belarusia. And met Lithuanians there, and kind of played the knygnešiai, because they came with Lithuanian literature, and ended up giving them that and sharing, historical experiences, and singing partisan songs and alike.
Anti-Soviet partisans,
yes.
You mean, right? So tell me, how is your research relevant to those who, let's say, study 60s or 70s or 80s in other regions?
Yeah, my book is very wide in that sense that it looks at a variety of aspects. And I think, those who work on krajevedinė or kraštotyra in the different parts of Soviet Union definitely can use it. Those who work on hippies obviously could use it, but also in general, the policy in itself, national policy in the Soviet Union overall, I hope, that would be one interesting source.
Right. So now you are here in Vilnius doing research. This is your short scientific mission. As I said, you are part of the EUROPAST team. What are you working on now?
So multiple projects, but one of the major projects that I'm working at the moment is what I call ethnic tourism. This concept is from the KGB sources that basically applies to diaspora tourism. And I don't only mean Lithuanian diaspora, I mean the Jewish diaspora, the Polish diaspora, the German diaspora. So people basically who between 1939 to 1945 left the country and regarded at least some parts of it, let's say Klaipėda or Vilnius, as their homeland. Especially in Polish case, that was very, there was an enormous proximity of this because the resettlements were still taking place. But my most focus is on Lithuanian diaspora, obviously, by this sort of travel. And there I look at both interest files that I'm actually looking at the moment at the archive, as well as the KGB files. Mm-hmm. Another group that I'm interested in is also the Jews, because it has a very important global dimension, I feel. The Jews that traveled from mainly US to Soviet Lithuania and were often also infiltrated by Nativ, which was the Israeli organization. In addition to that, I'm also working on biographical project on Juozas Ambrazevičius Brazaitis, who was the leader of Lithuanian Provisional Government, 1941. And here I'm interested in both his activism as a part of Lithuanian diaspora in the US throughout the Cold War, but also in his memory today.
Thank you very much for this really interesting conversation. Best of luck with your research.
Thank you.